Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're examining a real historical decision that quietly altered the direction of the Pacific War. This is not a story about heroics or slogans, but about behavior under pressure and what happens when assumptions collapse. Our focus begins on one island, one airfield, and one moment when Japan realized the war would not unfold as expected. On the morning of the 7th of August, 1942, the war in the Pacific changed shape without ceremony. U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal and secured an unfinished airstrip that would soon be called Henderson Field. The landing itself was not unusual by the standards of the time. What followed was. Japan had spent months advancing, and its officers still believed that any isolated enemy force could be broken quickly under pressure. This is the critical hook. The Marines did not win Guadalcanal with a single decisive blow. They won by refusing to leave. Under bombardment, under night attack, under disease and supply shortages, the Marines stayed in place and kept the airfield operating. That endurance forced Japanese commanders to confront a new reality. Their doctrine assumed collapse. What they faced instead was continuity. The first sign came fast. On 21st August 1942, Japanese forces launched a night assault east of Henderson Field at Alligator Creek, later known as the Battle of the Tenaru. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki advanced with confidence, expecting darkness to fracture the Marine perimeter. Instead, his unit ran into disciplined fire, controlled sectors, and a defense that held together under pressure. The Marines did not simply absorb the attack. At dawn, they counterattacked with infantry and tanks, destroying Ichiki's force almost completely. The disparity in losses shocked Japanese officers. More important than the numbers was the implication. Night, once considered a Japanese advantage, had failed to produce the expected psychological collapse. The enemy had adapted. This mattered because it was not an isolated event. Guadalcanal revealed a system at work. Marine units built defenses designed specifically to survive confusion. Interlocking fields of fire, clear command responsibility, and immediate counteraction turned night assaults into predictable patterns rather than chaos. Darkness stopped being a weapon and became just another phase of the fight. By September 1942, the campaign settled into a relentless grind. Raids, counter-raids, jungle patrols, and artillery harassment became routine. Japanese veterans later described the most unsettling discovery not as American firepower, but American persistence. Marines maintained patrol schedules, repaired the airfield, and kept pressure on despite malaria, hunger, and exhaustion. This was where Guadalcanal became a test of endurance rather than maneuver. The side that could keep supplying ammunition, food, and replacements would dictate the tempo. Marines fought not as a force waiting for relief, but as one structured to operate continuously. For Japanese units dependent on risky night resupply runs, this imbalance widened with every week. Henderson Field was the center of gravity throughout the campaign. As long as it functioned, American aircraft threatened Japanese shipping by day. Japan responded with nighttime reinforcement missions, but these delivered men without sufficient heavy equipment or supplies. Every attempt to mass forces carried risk. Every pause allowed the Marines to strengthen their position. This dynamic turned Guadalcanal into a trap. When Japanese forces attacked, they took losses. When they paused, the Marines expanded, improved defenses, and tightened control. Each cycle deepened Japanese attrition without delivering a decisive result. The longer the campaign lasted, the clearer the outcome became. Time itself favored the side that could endure. By early 1943, Japan withdrew from Guadalcanal. The material losses were severe on both sides, but the strategic result was decisive. The Allies now held the initiative. The Pacific War shifted from Japanese expansion to an Allied advance conducted island by island. Guadalcanal established the operational logic that would define everything that followed. Equally important was the psychological shift. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft and unwilling to endure hardship. Guadalcanal destroyed that image. Marines were not invulnerable, but they were consistent. They fought as teams, absorbed casualties without losing cohesion, and treated losses as a cost tied to the objective, not as a signal to quit. For the Marines, Guadalcanal became a template. They learned that holding ground under extreme conditions was possible if combined arms and discipline were maintained. For Japanese commanders, the lesson was more unsettling. The enemy they expected to panic and bargain was not arriving. A different enemy had appeared, one prepared to pay in blood and keep advancing. That lesson spread beyond the island. Survivors carried it to staff briefings and defensive plans across the Pacific. Future battles would no longer assume rapid collapse. Instead, Japanese defenses would harden, deepen, and prepare for prolonged resistance. The next test would not be fought in jungle perimeters, but against concrete bunkers on coral sand. The place was Tarawa. The date was November 20th, 1943. Guadalcanal had shown what the Marines were willing to endure. Tarawa would show how far they were willing to go. Write in the comments which city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. That's the best support you can give. And we move on. Tarawa compresses the Pacific War into a single brutal equation: a fortified island versus an assault force willing and able to take it at any cost. On November 20th, 1943, the U.S. 2nd Marine Division landed on Baisio, a narrow strip of coral barely 2 miles long. What followed over the next 76 hours was not maneuver warfare, but direct collision. The Japanese garrison fought almost to extinction. The Marines took appalling losses. The objective was still secured on schedule. From the Japanese perspective, Tarawa immediately appeared irrational. The landing went wrong from the first minutes. A misjudged tide and an exposed coral reef left many landing craft stranded hundreds of meters from shore. Marines were forced to wade forward under machine gun fire, carrying weapons and radios above their heads. Casualties mounted before units even reached the beach. In most armies, this would have triggered a halt. It did not. Instead of pausing, the Marines pushed more men forward. Fire support shifted closer. Weapons were dragged across open sand under direct fire. For the Japanese defenders watching from bunkers, the critical shock was not how many Americans fell, but that more kept coming immediately behind them. The assault did not reset. It simply absorbed losses and continued in place. This behavior violated Japanese expectations of how an enemy reacts to failure. Doctrine assumed that severe disruption at the point of landing would fracture command and delay further action. At Tarawa, disruption became background noise. Marine units reorganized on the beach itself. Junior leaders took over when officers fell. Momentum was maintained not by finesse, but by refusal to disengage. Tarawa also exposed the asymmetry between attacker and defender in a way that no briefing could disguise. The Japanese garrison was finite. Ammunition, water, and medical supplies were limited and unrecoverable. Every man lost was permanent. Every weapon destroyed reduced defensive strength. The Marines, by contrast, fought with naval gunfire behind them and transports feeding men and ammunition forward. As the battle continued, this imbalance deepened. Japanese positions were well constructed, with reinforced concrete bunkers and interlocking fire. They inflicted heavy casualties, but each bunker destroyed reduced the defensive system irreversibly. For the Marines, every position cleared created space to bring more firepower forward. The direction of change always favored the attacker, even when the cost was extreme. What unsettled Japanese observers was that cost alone did not alter marine behavior. Losses that would normally trigger consolidation instead produced escalation. Tanks were brought in. Engineers followed. Flamethrowers and demolition charges were used methodically. Tarawa demonstrated that marine assaults were not emotional reactions, but processes that continued until the defender ceased to exist. By the end of the battle, nearly the entire Japanese garrison was dead. Marine casualties were among the heaviest of any amphibious operation to that point. Yet from a strategic viewpoint, the result was clear. The island was taken on the planned timetable. That ratio, horrific losses combined with mission completion, became the most disturbing lesson carried forward by Japanese survivors. As 1944 unfolded, island battles ceased to be isolated events and became linked steps in a tightening sequence. Each defeat reduced Japan's defensive options and forced planners to adopt deeper, more attritional positions. But attrition only works if the attacker can be slowed or discouraged. Japanese officers expected that repeated high casualties might temper American operational tempo. Instead, they saw forces rotate, rebuild, and return. This pattern became unmistakable at Peleliu, beginning on September 15, 1944. The island's terrain, jagged ridges, caves, and coral, was deliberately chosen to negate bombardment and force close combat. The Japanese defense was sophisticated and deadly. American casualties were severe, and the fighting stretched for more than 2 months. Yet the structure of the battle remained familiar. Marine and Army units reduced Peleliu piece by piece. Ridges were isolated. Cave systems were sealed or cleared. Positions that resisted for days eventually fell. The process was slow and costly, but it did not reverse. Even when Marine divisions were badly depleted, replacements arrived and operations continued. Peleliu reinforced a conclusion Japanese officers increasingly accepted. Defenders could delay, but not deny. By this stage, Japanese intelligence sought to explain what made Marines different in practical terms. The conclusion was not mystical. Marines were aggressive at small unit level, patrolled constantly, and counterattacked without waiting for perfect conditions. Authority was pushed downward. Decisions that Japanese doctrine reserved for officers were often made by sergeants and corporals. This mattered enormously in combat. Killing a leader did not freeze a Marine unit. Another stepped forward and continued. Blocking one route did not halt the advance. Engineers appeared and created another. Defensive plans that relied on predictable pauses found those pauses never arrived. Japanese positions were not always overwhelmed. They were bypassed, isolated, and destroyed in sequence. By late 1944, Japan's strategic situation left little ambiguity. The Americans would continue moving west. The question was no longer whether they could be stopped, but how much time could be bought. Defensive planning shifted toward inflicting maximum casualties in the hope of influencing American political decision-making rather than battlefield outcomes. One island came to symbolize this final logic: Iwo Jima. Small, volcanic, and heavily fortified, it offered no illusion of victory. Its value lay in cost. If the Marines could be made to pay an unprecedented price there, perhaps the pattern might finally change. Perhaps momentum could be broken not tactically, but psychologically. The man assigned to that task was General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Unlike earlier commanders, he rejected wasteful frontal charges and focused on controlled attrition. His defense emphasized concealment, depth, and survival under bombardment. The objective was not to repel the landing, but to prolong the battle and maximize Marine casualties over time. Kuribayashi understood what Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu had already proven. He could not defeat the Marines outright. He could only force them to fight longer and bleed more heavily than before. His preparations reflected that understanding. Tunnels instead of surface positions, overlapping fire instead of massed attacks, and patience instead of dramatic gestures. When the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they encountered the most carefully designed island defense Japan had ever built. The question that followed was not abstract. It was concrete and unavoidable. After years of absorbing losses without stopping, after Tarawa and Peleliu, would this fortress finally alter Marine momentum? The answer would define the last phase of the Pacific War. By the beginning of 1945, Japanese defensive doctrine in the Central Pacific had hardened into something precise and unsentimental. Early war ideas about decisive counterattacks and dramatic last stands were no longer central. Commanders now planned for isolation, destruction, and death as structural realities. No officer embodied this shift more clearly than General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, appointed to defend Iwo Jima with no expectation of relief or victory. Kurabayashi understood the island's role with clarity. Iwo Jima was not meant to be held indefinitely, nor was it expected to be saved. Its purpose was arithmetic. Every day the island resisted delayed American operations elsewhere. Every casualty inflicted increased the cost of the war. His letters reveal a commander fully aware of the likely outcome, yet determined to extract maximum value from inevitable defeat. To do this, Kurabayashi rejected wasteful surface defenses. He banned large-scale frontal charges and refused to expend men for symbolic gestures. Instead, he built depth. Hundreds of bunkers were concealed rather than displayed. Artillery was hidden and repositioned through tunnels. Positions were designed to survive bombardment and continue fighting after being bypassed. By the time the American invasion began on February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima had been transformed into a fortified underground complex. Roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders occupied a lattice of tunnels, caves, and mutually supporting firing points. The surface of the island revealed little. The real battlefield existed beneath it, invisible to naval guns and aerial photography. The American landing force was immense. Over the course of the battle, nearly 70,000 U.S. Marines would fight on the island, supported continuously by naval gunfire, carrier aircraft, and logistics ships offshore. The scale alone reflected how seriously the Americans treated the objective. Iwo Jima was not symbolic. It was operational. The first hours of the landing confirmed Kurabayashi's concept. The beaches were narrow and exposed, composed of loose volcanic sand that swallowed boots and vehicles alike. As Marines advanced inland, Japanese artillery and machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Casualties mounted quickly as units struggled to establish coherent lines. From a Japanese perspective, this was validation. The Marines were bleeding heavily. The landing was costly. Positions held. But the second half of the equation followed immediately. The Marines did not withdraw. They did not regroup offshore. They adapted in place, pushed weapons forward, and continued advancing into the fire. This pattern repeated itself across the island. Marine operations on Iwo Jima followed a deliberate, methodical rhythm. A position was located. Fire was concentrated to suppress it. Engineers and tanks were brought forward. Flamethrowers and demolition charges were employed. The position was reduced. Then the process began again against the next objective. There was nothing impulsive about this approach. It was industrial warfare applied at infantry scale. Progress was measured in yards. Time was measured in hours and days, not breakthroughs. Casualties were anticipated, recorded, and absorbed. The system did not rely on surprise or panic. It relied on continuity. This continuity depended on training and replacement. Marine units on Iwo Jima took losses that would have shattered forces without depth. Platoons were reduced, companies bled white, and battalions required reinforcement. Yet the offensive continued because replacements arrived, command structures held, and missions remained unchanged. This was not accidental. Wartime Marine training was designed to produce riflemen who could be integrated rapidly into existing units. Leadership was decentralized enough that units could continue operating even when senior personnel were lost. On Iwo Jima, this structure proved essential. Japanese defenders noticed this immediately. From their perspective, killing individual Marines did not stop the attack. Wounding leaders did not paralyze units. Every destroyed position seemed to draw more pressure rather than less. The longer the battle continued, the more obvious it became that attrition favored the attacker, not the defender. Supply amplified this imbalance. Japanese garrisons fought with fixed stockpiles. Ammunition shortages were constant. Medical care was minimal. Water was rationed. Once supplies were consumed, they could not be replaced. Kuribayashi himself wrote about scarcity and deprivation, even as he attempted to manage resistance. The Marines, by contrast, fought at the end of a pipeline. Ammunition flowed forward. Casualties were evacuated. Fresh units rotated in. Artillery ammunition was expended in quantities the defenders could not imagine matching. Each day the island remained contested, weakened Japanese resistance while strengthening American capability. Despite this, the defense achieved its intended effect in one sense. Iwo Jima inflicted extraordinary casualties. Over 26,000 American casualties were recorded, including nearly 6,800 killed. These losses shocked observers at home and confirmed Japanese expectations about the cost of island assault. But the larger strategic question was answered in real time. Did the cost stop the Marines? It did not. The offensive continued without operational pause. Units were reinforced. Attacks resumed. Positions fell. Kuribayashi's defense inflicted pain, but it did not alter direction. By 26 March 1945, organized resistance on Iwo Jima had ended. The island was secured. Nearly all Japanese defenders were dead. The Marines had paid an enormous price, but they had taken every objective. From a doctrinal perspective, this outcome was decisive. The lesson Japanese planners drew was not about courage. It was about predictability. Marines behaved in a consistent, almost mechanical way. They would continue attacking as long as supply and command remained intact. This made defensive planning brutally simple and brutally hopeless. Defense became a question of time. How long can a position hold? How many casualties can be inflicted before reduction becomes inevitable? How many days can be bought elsewhere? These calculations replaced earlier hopes of battlefield victory. Kuribayashi's defense represented the most refined answer Japan could offer. It maximized casualties. It delayed progress. It forced the Americans into the most expensive form of victory. But it could not break momentum. The Marine assault system proved resilient enough to absorb the cost. In this sense, Iwo Jima was not an anomaly. It was confirmation. Guadalcanal had revealed endurance. Tarawa had shown refusal to stop. Peleliu had demonstrated persistence under extreme conditions. Iwo Jima unified these traits into a single, brutal demonstration. For Japanese strategic thinking in 1945, the implication was stark. If even the strongest island fortress could be reduced, then future defenses could only aim to delay, not deny. Victory was no longer defined as holding ground, but as extracting time and casualties before collapse. Iwo Jima therefore served as a prelude rather than a conclusion. It proved that Marine momentum could survive even the most carefully prepared defense. It also clarified what the final battles of the Pacific would look like: prolonged, costly, and fought against an enemy that already understood exactly what was coming. The next battlefield would expand this logic further. It would involve civilian populations, larger forces, and an imperial army fully aware that defeat was likely, but resistance still required. That battlefield lay just weeks ahead. April 1945, Okinawa. And the final phase of the war was about to begin. On April 1, 1945, Allied forces landed on Okinawa under Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The beaches were taken with relatively limited resistance, and for a brief moment the landing looked deceptively manageable. The real shock came later, when Japanese defenses revealed their true design. Okinawa was not meant to repel the invasion at the shoreline. It was built to consume the attacker inland, step by step. Japanese commanders had studied every major island battle since Guadalcanal. They understood that contesting beaches wasted lives without stopping landings. Instead, they prepared a defense meant to survive bombardment, absorb punishment, and force the enemy into a prolonged ground fight. Okinawa became the first battlefield where this doctrine was applied on a massive scale against Marines who already knew what awaited them. The ground defense was organized under the 32nd Army, commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima. His main defensive system was concentrated in southern Okinawa along a network of ridges, caves, and reverse slope positions, often grouped under the term Shuri Line. These positions were chosen carefully. They denied direct observation, resisted naval gunfire, and forced attackers into exposed approaches. The logic behind this system was professional and unsentimental. Japanese forces did not expect to hold Okinawa permanently. Their objective was to trade space for time and blood. Each ridge was a calculation. Each cave complex was meant to slow the advance and impose casualties before being abandoned or destroyed. Victory was redefined as endurance measured in days and losses inflicted. At sea, Okinawa unfolded as a separate and equally intense battle. Japan launched the largest coordinated kamikaze campaign of the war. Waves of aircraft attacked the invasion fleet daily, aiming not to disrupt tactics but to destroy ships outright. For sailors, this created constant psychological strain. Every radar contact carried the possibility of direct impact rather than interception. Japanese planners believed naval losses might achieve what ground defenses alone could not. If enough ships were sunk, the invasion might stall, or supplies might be disrupted. Instead, the U.S. Navy absorbed severe damage and continued operating. Ships were lost, crews were killed, but logistics continued to flow. The fleet did not break, and the ground campaign did not pause. This resilience sharpened Japanese perceptions of Marines in particular. Marines were no longer seen as simply aggressive infantry. They were understood as the visible edge of a system that continued functioning under constant strain. Okinawa's casualty figures were staggering: over 12,000 American dead and many more wounded across all services, yet operations never fully stopped. In Japanese defensive logic, such losses should have imposed operational hesitation. Commanders expected pauses, reorganizations, and shifts in tempo. Okinawa proved otherwise. The advance slowed, but it did not reverse. Pressure remained constant. Positions that held for days were eventually reduced. There was no moment where losses alone forced disengagement. For Marines on the ground, the campaign became methodical and exhausting. Each ridgeline was reduced by artillery, infantry assault, and engineering work. Cave systems were sealed, cleared, or destroyed. Mud, rain, and shattered roads made movement slow and dangerous. The battlefield allowed no concealment of cost. Every advance was paid for in visible casualties. This environment was precisely where Japanese defenders expected American morale to falter. Instead, Marines adapted. Units rotated forward and back. Fire support was adjusted continuously. Progress was measured in meters, not miles, but it continued. The offensive logic remained intact even when the pace slowed dramatically. What Japanese soldiers found most difficult to accept was not American firepower, but American endurance. A fixed garrison fought with diminishing resources. An amphibious force fought with replenishment. Okinawa was supplied by sea and air. Ammunition, food, medical support, and replacements arrived continuously. Japanese units, isolated and bombarded, grew weaker with each passing week. As the campaign dragged on, this imbalance became decisive. Japanese commanders increasingly framed success not in tactical terms, but political ones. If American casualties could be made high enough, perhaps the United States would reconsider invasion of the home islands. Okinawa thus became a proving ground for a strategy that sought leverage through loss rather than battlefield control. The civilian dimension of Okinawa intensified the campaign's meaning. Large numbers of civilians were caught within the combat zone. Villages lay between defensive lines. Civilians suffered terribly as the fighting progressed. For Japanese soldiers, this offered a grim preview of what a home island invasion might look like: total war fought within populated areas under bombardment and close combat. By June 1945, the Japanese defense in southern Okinawa was collapsing. Positions were overrun or abandoned. Communications broke down. General Ushijima and his chief of staff committed suicide as organized resistance ended. The campaign is generally dated to 22nd June 1945, though isolated fighting continued afterward. Okinawa's outcome was not surprising in strategic terms. Japan had expected defeat. What mattered was the cost. The island had inflicted heavy casualties on American forces and significant losses on the U.S. Navy. Yet despite this, the Americans completed the operation. Supplies flowed. Units rotated. The system held. For Japanese defenders, the lesson aligned with everything learned since 1942. Marines could be delayed and bloodied. They could not be stopped if their supply and replacement system remained intact. Attrition alone was insufficient to alter the direction of the war. This realization extinguished remaining hopes of battlefield victory. After Okinawa, Japanese strategy narrowed to a final gamble. If the next battle could be made catastrophic enough, perhaps political calculations in Washington would change. This hope no longer relied on defeating Marines tactically. It relied on making the cost of defeating them appear unbearable. There was no longer any illusion about what came next. The war was moving toward Japan itself. Both sides prepared for an invasion of the home islands. American planners called it Operation Downfall. Japanese planners developed Ketsugo, a plan to turn the home islands into a single extended Okinawa. Okinawa had proven the marine assault system could endure extraordinary loss without breaking. It had also shown Japan the limits of attrition as a strategy. What remained was one final question: whether even greater sacrifice could change the outcome before invasion began. The answer would not be decided on Okinawa, but Okinawa ensured that when the war's final decisions were made, both sides understood exactly what marine momentum meant and exactly what it would cost to challenge it again. By mid-1945, American strategic planning narrowed to a single, unavoidable conclusion. The war would end either with Japan's collapse or with an invasion of the home islands. This plan was formalized as Operation Downfall, a two-stage assault beginning with Operation Olympic against Kyushu, followed by Operation Coronet, aimed at the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. Geography made secrecy irrelevant. The likely landing zones were obvious, and Japanese planners identified them early. Both sides now operated inside a closing funnel. The Pacific War had consumed Japan's outer defenses, then its inner perimeter. What remained was the core. Every decision taken after Okinawa was shaped by the knowledge that time, resources, and strategic depth were nearly exhausted. The war's final outcome would be decided not by maneuver, but by whether one side could endure the final cost longer than the other. Japan's response was Operation Ketsugo, a plan that represented the last evolution of its wartime thinking. Ketsugo was not a plan for victory in the conventional sense. It was an admission that Japan could not defeat the United States industrially or militarily. Instead, it aimed to break American political resolve by inflicting losses so severe that continuation of the war would appear unacceptable. The logic behind Ketsugo was cold and deliberate. Japanese leadership concluded that battlefield defeat did not necessarily mean national extinction if the enemy could be persuaded to negotiate. The objective was not to throw invaders back into the sea, but to make every mile of advance so costly that the invasion itself became politically toxic in Washington. Attrition was transformed from a tactical tool into a strategic weapon. This logic was a direct descendant of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Those battles had proven that Marines could not be stopped by defensive skill alone. They could be delayed, they could be bled, but they continued advancing as long as supplies and replacements flowed. Japanese planners understood that future defenses had to assume continuous pressure rather than pauses between assaults. The central fear behind Ketsugo was not American bombing or naval power. It was the arrival of assault troops who would keep attacking regardless of losses. In Japanese operational memory, Marines represented the sharpest edge of that threat. They had repeatedly demonstrated an ability to absorb casualties, reorganize, and continue attacking without waiting for the defender to exhaust himself. This behavior invalidated key assumptions of traditional defense. Many defensive systems rely on the attacker pausing after heavy losses. Marines did not reliably pause. Japanese planning therefore treated Marine landings as inevitable mechanical processes rather than events that could be influenced through morale shock or symbolic resistance. Japanese intelligence assessments emphasized this point repeatedly. Marines were described not as reckless, but as relentless. Their willingness to accept casualties in order to close with defenders meant that time favored them, not the garrison. Once contact was made, the outcome became a matter of arithmetic rather than inspiration. Another critical factor was logistics. Okinawa had demonstrated that the United States could sustain massive operations under extreme pressure. Despite kamikaze attacks and heavy naval losses, supply lines held. Ground forces were fed continuously. Ammunition consumption exceeded anything Japan could match. Japanese planners understood that this imbalance would only grow closer to the home islands. A defense of Japan itself would face heavier bombardment than any previous battlefield. Ports, railways, and airfields would be targeted relentlessly. The U.S. Navy could concentrate forces without serious opposition at sea. Japan could no longer protect its internal lines of communication. Ketsugo therefore sought to compensate through concentrated suicide attacks against the invasion fleet. In effect, Ketsugo envisioned Okinawa's naval battle expanded to maximum scale. Every remaining aircraft, pilot, and weapon would be committed to inflicting damage on transports and warships at the moment of landing. This was not only ideological, it was one of the few remaining ways to convert limited resources into potentially decisive effects. From the American perspective, Okinawa forced planners to confront the potential cost of invasion directly. Casualty estimates for downfall varied widely, but the operational lesson was clear. Amphibious assault against prepared defenses produced losses at a scale that could strain even the United States. This reality shaped discussions at the highest levels of American leadership. Japanese leaders understood this concern and built their hopes around it. They did not need to defeat American forces everywhere. They needed to raise the price high enough to change political calculations. In this sense, Ketsugo was less a military plan than a gamble on American democratic sensitivity to casualties. However, the strategy contained a fatal contradiction. The more Japan mobilized its population and turned the home islands into a battlefield, the greater the risk of national devastation. Okinawa's civilian losses served as a warning. Fighting on densely populated islands under heavy bombardment could destroy society itself, not just military capability. This was not merely a humanitarian issue. It was strategic. A Japan reduced to ruins might survive as a political entity, but its post-war position would be defined by devastation. Leaders understood this risk, yet felt trapped by circumstances. Avoiding invasion required demonstrating willingness to endure catastrophe. A second contradiction lay in execution. Ketsugo depended on precise timing and concentrated force. But late-war Japan suffered from severe shortages. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft were worn. Pilot training was shortened drastically. Suicide tactics increasingly replaced conventional operations, not from fanaticism alone, but from necessity. These measures reflected a harsh reality. Japan could no longer meet American air power on equal terms. Kamikaze attacks were an attempt to bypass that imbalance by trading aircraft and pilots for ships. Their effectiveness depended on scale and surprise, both increasingly difficult to achieve. For Marines, the significance of downfall was straightforward. They would likely form the core of the assault forces, and Japanese defenders expected them. Years of combat had produced a clear image of Marine behavior: aggressive, small-unit movement, rapid exploitation of weaknesses, and continued attack under losses. Whether these perceptions were fully accurate mattered less than the conclusion drawn from them. Japanese planners assumed that if Marines landed, defenders would face an enemy trained to continue advancing until positions were physically destroyed. Defensive systems were therefore built around endurance rather than hopes of repelling assaults. At this point, fear became a practical military calculation. Marines were feared not as individuals, but as processes. Contact led to escalation. Escalation led to reduction. Reduction continued until the defender was eliminated. This understanding stripped warfare of heroic language and replaced it with accounting: time, ammunition, casualties, replacements. Japan's final defensive concept was an attempt to win that accounting politically. It acknowledged that military victory was unlikely. What remained was the hope that cost alone could alter the enemy's decision-making before complete destruction occurred. History intervened before this final test. Operation Downfall was never launched. The war ended through a combination of battlefield collapse, atomic bombing, and political decision within Japan. The invasion Japan prepared for did not come. What remained after surrender was memory. Japanese soldiers and officers reflected on years of fighting Marines across the Pacific. The lesson they carried forward was consistent. Marines could be wounded, delayed, and killed in great numbers, but pain alone did not halt them. This perception outlasted the war itself. It shaped post-war testimonies, intelligence reports, and veteran recollections. Marines were remembered as an enemy that combined determination with inexhaustible support. Facing them meant entering a process that continued until one side ceased to exist on the battlefield. The final irony of Ketsugo was that it was never tested. Yet its assumptions reveal how deeply Japanese understanding of the Marines had evolved. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army no longer doubted American resolve in combat. It doubted only whether that resolve could be politically sustained. The war's end removed the final calculation from the battlefield, but the logic forged from Guadalcanal to Okinawa remained. Japanese soldiers had learned that courage alone could not overcome an enemy that matched determination with resources. That understanding defined their final plans and their final fears. When the war ended in August 1945, Japan's official narratives collapsed with remarkable speed. Years of propaganda portraying Americans as weak, indulgent, and incapable of sustained hardship could not survive contact with reality. Battlefield experience had already undermined those claims, but surrender removed the final barrier to acknowledgement. For many Japanese veterans, the hardest adjustment was not defeat itself, but the realization that the enemy they had been taught to dismiss had fought with discipline, cohesion, and endurance that Japanese doctrine had consistently underestimated. This reckoning did not happen overnight. It unfolded through interrogation reports, occupation-era interviews, private letters, and later memoirs. Again and again, Japanese soldiers returned to the same theme. The Americans, and especially the Marines, had not behaved as expected. They did not collapse when cut off. They did not cease attacking after heavy losses. They did not rely on morale shock to win. The reputation of the Marines emerged precisely from this gap between expectation and observed behavior. It is essential to clarify what it meant when Japanese soldiers said they feared the Marines. This was not superstition or myth-making. Marines were not viewed as supernatural or immune to death. Fear, in this context, described a professional assessment formed under fire. Japanese defenders observed that even when Marines suffered severe casualties, their units continued to function, reorganize, and press the attack. Losses did not reliably translate into hesitation or withdrawal. On islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, this pattern created a distinct psychological environment for defenders. A bunker or cave position might hold for hours, sometimes days, or even weeks. But the pressure rarely reversed direction. Fire returned. Engineers arrived. Tanks reappeared. The same position was engaged again and again until it was reduced or sealed. For the men inside, this produced a sense of inevitability rather than panic. That inevitability was the foundation of fear. Japanese soldiers understood that survival depended not on winning the engagement, but on how long resistance could be sustained. Even a successful defense rarely brought relief. It brought escalation. Each time Marines encountered resistance, they responded by increasing force rather than disengaging. The defender's success therefore accelerated his own destruction. The second element shaping this perception was combined arms. Marines did not fight as isolated infantry. They operated within a tightly integrated system that linked riflemen to artillery, naval gunfire, armor, engineers, and air support. This meant that a position judged strong under one set of conditions became vulnerable under another. A bunker immune to small arms fire could be demolished. A ridge resistant to tanks could be isolated and pounded. A cave protected from bombardment could be sealed or cleared through coordinated assault. Japanese defenders learned that no position was final. A good defensive location bought time, not safety. Marines were feared as the final component of this system, the men willing to advance into confined spaces after bombardment and demolition had done their work. The close fight inside bunkers and caves was where human resolve mattered most, and where Marines consistently pressed forward. The third, and perhaps most decisive factor, was logistics. Japanese veterans spoke of this with a mixture of frustration and respect. Island defense meant scarcity. Ammunition was limited. Medical supplies were inadequate. Food shortages were constant. Once the sea was controlled by the U.S. Navy, reinforcement became impossible. Every round fired and every wound suffered permanently weakened the garrison. In contrast, American forces fought at the end of an industrial pipeline. On Okinawa, Marines and other U.S. units continued receiving ammunition, food, medical support, and replacements even under intense attack. Naval losses were severe, yet the flow continued. To the defender watching from a cave or ridge, this created a brutal contrast. The Marine advancing toward him was not just an individual soldier, but the visible expression of a system that did not exhaust itself on schedule. Okinawa demonstrated this reality at maximum scale. The casualty figures were staggering on both sides, particularly for American forces, including severe naval losses caused by air attacks. Yet the operation continued without decisive interruption. By late June 1945, organized Japanese resistance collapsed. For Japanese planners, this outcome carried a stark implication. Attrition had limits. It could inflict pain. It could delay, but it might not produce the political reversal Japan needed in time. This realization explains why Ketsugo and Operation Downfall mattered, even though the invasion never occurred. Japan's final defensive planning was based on the belief that American will could be broken through casualties, because battlefield victory was no longer realistic. But the Marine record from 1942 to 1945 suggested a hard constraint. Marines did not treat casualties as leverage inside the battle. They treated them as cost. This distinction is crucial. It does not imply indifference to loss. It reflects institutional design. The Marine Corps was structured in wartime to continue offensive operations despite losses, as long as supply, command, and replacements held. Japanese soldiers recognized this difference intuitively. They saw that killing Marines did not end the attack. It often intensified it. After surrender, occupation and post-war reflection reshaped how Japanese veterans spoke about this experience. Fear did not automatically become admiration, and resentment did not disappear. But descriptions became more precise. Marines were remembered as an enemy who forced defenders into a narrowing set of options. Remain in position and be reduced. Attempt movement and be detected. Or die where you were. In this sense, fear was not emotional panic. It was operational memory. It reflected repeated encounters where defensive choices diminished over time. Each battle reinforced the same lesson. Once Marines committed to an objective, the defender's agency shrank steadily until resistance ended. A necessary clarification for a documentary account is that Marines were not the only effective American troops. U.S. Army divisions fought and won major battles across the Pacific. Okinawa itself was a joint campaign under the U.S. 10th Army, involving large Army formations. Japanese veterans often distinguished Marines not by superiority, but by style and tempo. Marines were perceived as assault specialists. They were expected to accept close combat, advance into fortified ground, and continue pressing even when casualties were high. Whether this perception was always accurate mattered less than its effect. Japanese commanders planned defenses around what they believed Marines would do, and that belief shaped both tactics and morale before the fighting began. When Japanese soldiers spoke of fearing Marines, they were not describing terror in the abstract. They were describing predictability. Marines represented a known process. Contact led to escalation. Escalation led to reduction. Reduction continued until the position was eliminated. This transformed warfare from a contest of spirit into an exercise in accounting. Japan tried many responses to this problem: night attacks, deep bunker systems, cave defenses, suicide aviation, finally, plans for national resistance. Each method increased the price paid by the attacker. None reliably altered the outcome while American industrial and logistical capacity remained intact. By 1945, Japanese soldiers no longer believed Marines were inhuman. They believed Marines embodied the most dangerous combination possible: determination equal to their own, backed by resources Japan could not match. This belief was not born of ideology. It was formed through repeated experience across islands where courage alone proved insufficient. That understanding survived the war itself. It appears consistently in post-war interviews and recollections. The Marines were remembered not as mythical warriors, but as an enemy who would continue advancing regardless of cost because their nation enabled them to do so. Against such an opponent, sacrifice could be honorable, but it could not be decisive. In the end, the fear of fighting Marines was rooted in clarity. Japanese soldiers understood what would happen once Marines arrived. The timeline might vary, the cost might be enormous, but the direction was fixed. The battlefield would not negotiate. It would resolve itself through force until one side ceased to resist. That recognition defined Japan's final defensive thinking and shaped how the Pacific War was remembered by those who fought it. The Marines did not win through mystique or legend. They won through consistency. And it was that consistency, observed from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, that Japanese veterans carried with them long after the guns fell silent. This concludes our examination of why Japanese soldiers came to fear fighting the U.S. Marines in the Pacific War. It was not myth or propaganda, but repeated experience that shaped this understanding, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Thank you for watching and for spending this time with us. If you value calm, fact-based history, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows this work to continue.